Today we are reviewing the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Unbound 2P. This is a 2 trekking pole, 2 door, 2 vestibule, single wall, side entry, Dyneema composite fabrics shelter. It weighs about 1.5 pounds, retails right now for $699. It's very similar in price and design to the Z-Packs Duplex, so we'll be talking about the differences between those two tents specifically in this review as well. So let's talk about the primary differences between the Unbound and the Duplex. I would say that there are 2 prominent differences between the Unbound and the Duplex, although there are some other minor differences as well. The primary difference is that the Unbound's fly goes much closer to the ground than the Duplex. This has some important ramifications because you can shorten the guylines on the Unbound or eliminate them entirely and pitch the fly of the Unbound directly to the ground. This has a profound impact on stability and storm resistance. You can't really do that with the Duplex without substantially altering its geometry, and it just kind of messes everything up. The second prominent feature is in the side panel. Where the Z-Packs Duplex has a flat side panel, the Unbound's side panel is made of 3 separate panels and has some 3-dimensional shape to it. So one disadvantage of the Unbound is you absolutely have to have the 7th and 8th stakeout points. The Duplex, you can get away with 6 stakes, but you have to use 8 stakes with the Unbound. If you don't stake out these side panels, they're going to sag inward and the tent is not going to be pitched taut. The primary advantage to these 3D side panels is that it increases the livable interior volume a little bit better than the Z-Packs Duplex. Now there's going to be some people out there who say that the 3D side panels also improve the storm resistance of the Unbound. I'm not convinced of that, but we'll talk about it later. There are a couple of minor exterior differences between the Unbound and the Zuplex. Z-Packs Duplex as well. One is the vent. So the Duplex has a vent that goes all the way across, but is not quite as deep, and it's backed with mesh. The Unbound's vent is not backed with mesh, which is a good thing, and it's much deeper than the Duplexes. So even though the Unbound's vent only covers one side of the entire front, or back, it's on both sides, it is a bigger vent that allows for more airflow. The other difference is that on the Unbound we have a 2-way zipper, and that allows you to create views or ventilation without undoing the bottom of the door panel. And then finally on the Unbound we have no way to secure both sides of the door panel to the guy line, and that is one thing that you can do in the Duplex. Okay, let's go through some of the materials used in the tent. DCF5, which is Hyperlite's moniker for 1/2 ounce per square yard Dyneema composite fabrics, is used throughout the canopy. DCF8 is used on the floor. This is an 8/10 of an ounce per square yard fabric, a little bit lighter than the floor on the Duplex, which is 1 ounce per square yard. Now I know there's a lot of hoopla out there about whether DCF or sil poly or sil nylon is the best fabric for a tent floor. I've never had an issue with the DCF tent floor causing a problem. They're super easy to repair. I would argue that it's easier to repair than sil poly and sil nylon. Virtually all kinds of repair tapes stick to it just fine. The zippers on the door are number 3 YKK AquaGuard zippers. They are the lightest waterproof zipper available. That means you have to treat them with a little bit of care. So try to avoid getting dirt in them because they do fail when they get muddy or dirty. Now, Hyperlite does something on their mids that they did not do on the Unbound tent. And that is they create a little buckle at the join at the bottom of the 2 doors of their mids. And that relieves stress on the zipper because that zipper seam is one of the guy line tie-out points, and so it has a lot of tension on it. If you have this number 3 AquaGuard zipper down here under that much tension, it can be difficult to get this door all the way closed. And if you force it, it's going to cause the zipper teeth to separate. If you do that too many times, your zipper is going to fail. Z-Pack solves this in the Duplex by creating this little metal hook that hooks to both doors and maintains some stress relief at the bottom of that zipper. You can't do that on the Unbound. So when you're zipping and unzipping the door on the Unbound, you have to do it under some lessened tension or that zipper will separate. You can do that by relaxing the guy line a little bit, although obviously that's kind of a pain to do inside the tent. I hope Hyperlite heeds that advice and provides some way to relieve the tension at the bottom of the zipper doors, because I really would like to see these YKK AquaGuard number 3s last a long time and not be the point of failure on this tent. Here is your storage pocket. There's one on each end. This is an asymmetrical setup in terms of the way the doors and the pockets are configured. It's one giant piece of mesh. I've got a few tidbits of gear in here now. You can obviously store wet clothing in there. It's pretty big. It's a pretty big pocket. What I don't like about the pocket is that if you put heavy stuff in there, like I have my headlamp, my messenger, and my watch, it causes the bathtub floor to sag. So if you take the pocket and tie it into the zipper seam, you can prevent some of that because the zipper seam here is quite a bit stronger. So I would happily lose some opening in the pocket to have better structure here to store heavier gear. Okay, let's go through some basic specs with the Unbound. It is 48 inches wide, which is 3 inches wider than the Z-Pack's Duplex. It is 90 inches long, which is the same length, and 48 inches tall, which is the same length. The interior volume feels about the same until you get 2 people in here. And then because the Unbound has a little bit better side panel tie-out with the 3D panel construction, you feel like you have more interior headroom in here. In addition, the extra width does allow you to put 2 25-inch wide pads in here without it feeling so cramped like it does in the Duplex. Otherwise, the width and length of the footprint is about the same on both tents. They're both about 100 inches long. The Unbound is a little bit wider because of the wider floor width, but the Unbound does have slightly smaller vestibule, so it all washes out in the end. But if you're really tight on space, again, with the Unbound, you can stake the tent out with very short or no guy lines, and it's perfectly functional. And that can save a lot of footprint space, as well as obviously adding a lot of storm resistance. Let's go through some of the more notable interior features of the Unbound tent. The first one is that it includes a more traditional D-shaped door, but the door is pretty big and can be rolled away and then tied up via these cords right here. And that gives you access to gear storage and cooking in the vestibule if that's your jam. So far we've experienced a lot of rain and a lot of thunderstorms in the Unbound tent, and thumbs up. It's a very weather-worthy shelter, and I would say that it's a bit more storm resistant than the Duplex for a couple of reasons, but my favorite reason is that the fly on the Unbound goes all the way to the ground, or almost all the way to the ground. That compromises ventilation a little bit, so there might be marginal increases in condensation in the Unbound versus the Duplex, but in general I've noticed similar condensation on both in similar conditions. The Unbound contains 3 loops that are spread across the interior of the ridgeline. These can be used for gear hanging or clotheslines or whatever. The one thing that I really like about this is that they pulled the end loops away from the peak corner of the tent. You know how those end loops are sewn into that seam and they're so hard to attach stuff to them? And they pulled this one out a couple of inches, so it's very easy to access, which is a great little feature that they did. Down at the end of the tent, you can see the end vent. So this is both an end vent and a condensation drain. In contrast to some ultralight tents, including the Z-Pack's Duplex, those condensation drains tend to drain outward. So they provide the option for condensation to run down the interior of the fly, hit this drain, and then that drain is facing down, kind of like that. You have a little bit in the middle right here, but the Unbound's drain does not function like that. And I thought this would cause somewhat of a problem, but on heavy condensation nights, I have had no condensation hit the bottom of the tent floor on the inside. So the drain does work. Once moisture rolls down to that netting, the netting is very effective at kind of wicking it and dispersing it and letting it down to the ground rather than coming into your tent. One thing I do like about the Unbound over the Z-Packs in vents is that they actually function as vents in the Unbound. I wish they were bigger. I like lots of venting, but they do function a little bit better than Z-Packs because there's more surface area of mesh that's actually exposed. In the Duplex, the roof line and the bathtub floor are very close together and you don't get a lot of airflow in there. In terms of space, you can see that I have my 25-inch wide sleeping pad and quilt approximately in the middle of the tent, and there's plenty of space created by the 3D wall pull-out here that prevents the bottom of my sleeping bag from touching the end of the tent. And then if we go down to the other end, you can see that there's 16 inches of space up here for gear storage and headroom and whatnot. Now, this isn't my pick for a tent for a large person unless you sleep diagonally, but I think there might be better options for you out there. If you're 6.5 feet tall and need a long-sized sleeping pad, just recognize that you might have to shift diagonally or not have gear storage at the foot or head end of your sleeping bag. That's okay, but if you think this is going to be a two-person tent that holds 2 tall people, then you're going to have some limitations here. The tent is 48 inches wide, so it's a little bit wider than the Duplex, 3 inches or so, and that is just about enough width to hold 2 wide, 25-inch wide sleeping pads. Now, those are going to take up the entire width of the tent, and with the Duplex, you have a very deep bathtub floor. In the Unbound, you do not have a deep bathtub floor, and so if you have 2 wide pads in there, you're going to lose even more of the bathtub space. That should motivate you to be very intentional about where you camp, because if you're going to compromise the integrity of the floor by losing some of that bathtub space, then you're obviously not going to want to camp in an area that is poorly draining. In terms of rain protection, no issues, obviously. I've been in several inches of rain now with the tent, and it has performed outstanding. In terms of wind resistance, I would say that because I can pitch the Unbound lower to the ground and shorten the guylines, it's a more wind resistant tent than the Duplex. If you pitch the Duplex lower to the ground and shorten its guylines, you start disrupting its structure because it's designed to have the perimeter of the fly pitched several inches off the ground. Like the Duplex, the Unbound is terrible at snow loading. You get a lot of sag. There's a lot of fabric surface area involved here. As for the 3D panels and the extent to which they make the tent more wind resistant, I think that's a dubious claim. These panels are still very large, and you're exposing, all 3 of these panels to which form the one big side panel, to wind loading, and you're going to get a lot of flapping. There's just not a lot of resistance in there, and you cannot create much resistance with a guyline. What the guyline will do is prevent this panel from coming in dramatically if you had a huge wind gust, but it's not going to improve the structure appreciably. And that goes for snow loading as well. This is not a tent designed for any amount of snow other than maybe a trace that you might get in the summer. In terms of condensation resistance between the Duplex and this, the Duplex has a high fly hem going for it, so you get much more airflow underneath the tent. The Unbound has better end venting and better peak venting, but a lower fly hem. Honestly, I haven't noticed a lot of condensation differences between the Duplex and this. They're constructed so similarly that if you're in an environment where there's high humidity and low temperatures, you're going to get condensation in any kind of single wall shelter, and this is no exception. The venting and the or the peak vent and the end vent, it did not provide a silver bullet in this design, and I wasn't expecting. Like most tents of this design, the floor is a little bit narrower than the ridgeline, and that allows the sidewall to be angled a little bit so that you can have a door or two doors open and overhead rain will not come into the tent. Most of these tents have this feature, and so I don't really consider this a feature anymore. But if it's missing that and you open the sidewall and you can't have a door open without rain entering your tent, I would say that is a design flaw. There's a webbing loop sewn to the bottom of the bathtub floor right here, and it is designed to go around the trekking pole tip. The idea here is that fixing that loop to the trekking pole tip keeps the bathtub floor in place, and it keeps the bottom of the floor in place, but you can see that the top is a little bit floppy. What I'd prefer is some kind of shock cord or hook and loop strap here that goes around the lower end of the trekking pole, affixing the sidewall of the bathtub floor to the trekking pole. That's a couple of tent designs have that, and that's a more effective way to keep the shape and integrity of the sidewall of the bathtub floor in place if you have a lot of water running through your campsite. All of these tent designs, the Gossamer Gear 1 and 2, the Z-Packs, Duplex, Triplex, and the Hyperlite Unbound, are all what we call 6-panel tents. We have 2 panels for each of the doors. We have 2 panels for each of the sides. The Hyperlite obviously has 3 panels built into its sides, and so it's technically a 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 panel tent, but still has that general shape of a 6-panel tent. The problem with all these tents in terms of storm stability, and you can see this because even though the tent is pitched tight, I can move that peak point quite a bit. So that means when a wind buffets that tent, that peak point is going to move. The key to tent stability is getting that peak point not to move. And so really our only options are to tighten guylines. And so we can do that on the Duplex and see how close we can get. And how tight you can make your guylines is going to depend on how much holding power your tent stakes have. If your tent stakes are ultralight skewers, you're going to have very little holding power, and the stakes are going to pull out in response to heavy wind loading. Okay, so we can crank the guylines down nice and tight, and that improves the stability of that peak, but it doesn't solve the fact that it's moving. So let's take a look at what is structurally happening here. This peak is moving because the guylines are mobile. So you have a connection between the guyline and the stake that's several inches long, and that connection is mobile. You cannot fix the point at which the guyline attaches to the tent. It's a very elastic structural connection. So the way you resolve this is you stake the tent directly to the ground so that corner is not movable. This is the premise behind tarp tents' strut or pitch lock design. You are creating immobile points on the ground that the tent connects to, and that improves the structural integrity of the shelter. Now the Hyperlite Unbound gives us a little bit of flexibility because its canopy goes so low. That means we can shorten those guylines and minimize the movement of the guyline tent attachment point, and in theory that should result in more stability. So let's pitch the Unbound with short corner guylines and see how this works in action. Okay, so we can see we have a 12-inch long guyline here. Let's restake this so it's very, very short. So we'll shorten that guyline all the way up to the loop. And because we no longer have any flexibility in tensioning our corner guylines, we have to tighten the rectangle right when we stake it. We don't leave the stakeout points loose. Of course, I hit a rock right there. And we'll do this for each of our 4 corners here. Okay, we have our rectangle pitched, and the rectangle is pitched very tight. And you can see that we have a tight back seam or side seam there, a tight seam up to the peak of our trekking pole, and back down. So we got a perfect triangle on both the front and back of the tent as well, because we kept our trekking pole length the same. So at this point, we want to stake out the front of the shelter. And again, we want to shorten this front guy line as much as possible. And then we'll do the same to the back. Okay, and now we can tighten our ridgeline guy lines to bring that ridgeline taut. And then the final piece of the puzzle is to stake out the 3D panels. And again, you don't need a lot of tension on these. Just enough to give the tent its shape and prevent those panels from sagging. Okay, now what we have in theory, because we have the perimeter of the tent staked to the ground, we have less play in the guy lines. And so in theory, when a wind gust hits, the tent should be much more stable and this peak shouldn't move around as much. So over on the Duplex, we can see we have a good 6 to 8 inches of play in that peak. And over here on the Unbound, maybe an inch, inch and a half at max. So much more stable structure. And this is a result of the Hyperlite Unbound being able to be pitched right down to the ground. Now, obviously, that's gonna wreak havoc on your condensation, but just know that you have this feature in your back pocket if you need to withstand a really heavy storm. All right, that's it for this review of the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Unbound 2P shelter. I hope you found some value out of it. If you'd like to learn more, you can see our written review at backpackinglight.com. I will put that link in the description. Thanks for watching, everybody.